used any sedative drugs or anything like that. And, you know, we have cooperated fully with the police. We'll answer any queries, any test that they want to do at any point.
There's absolutely no evidence that Madeleine is dead.
But then you hear
let me finish, please. There's absolutely no evidence that Madeleine is dead, and there's absolutely no evidence that we were involved in her disappearance. Well, that is the conclusion. Let me finish. That is the conclusion of the process, and that's what we're here debating. The conclusions of the process versus the conclusions of the book.
So
they are not the same.
The conviction of the inspectors.
Why would we be shocked? We're not denying the existence. Why would we be shocked? We're not denying the existence of the dogs or anything else. It's evidence we're interested in. There is no evidence that Madeleine is dead.
They're actually the pyjamas that Madeleine was wearing when she was taken.
There is absolutely no evidence that Madeleine is dead. When Jerry McCann spoke those words, they weren't just a denial. They sounded like a shield, a wall built high against a storm that had already begun to rage around him and his wife, Kate. The words were sharp, deliberate, and firm, echoing far beyond the press conference. They were spoken to investigators, to the millions watching across the world, and perhaps most of all, to themselves. From the very beginning, the McCanns tied their survival to one unshakable belief: their daughter was still alive. That belief, controlled in tone but defiant in meaning, would soon become the emotional foundation of one of the most infamous missing person cases in modern history. On the night of May 3, 2007, in the quiet Portuguese resort town of Praia da Luz, life as they knew it was split into two irreconcilable halves: the time before and the time after. Kate's desperate scream, "They've taken her!" as she ran from apartment 5A, was more than the discovery of a missing child. It was the first cry in what would become a relentless and merciless story. From that moment, the case of Madeleine McCann was never just about a disappearance. It was about certainty versus doubt, evidence versus narrative, and grief versus public judgment. In front of the media, Jerry repeated his message again and again with striking clarity. "We have fully cooperated with the police. We will answer any queries. We will undergo any tests they request. There is absolutely no evidence that we were involved in her disappearance." His tone was not that of a man pleading for understanding. It was defensive, organized, and media-ready. The McCanns were not simply grieving parents. They became the architects of a message, one that had to be clear, consistent, and forceful if they were to survive both the trauma of their loss and the glare of worldwide scrutiny. But almost immediately, a storm of rumors swirled. Whispers suggested that Madeleine may have been sedated. Jerry confronted the idea head-on. "We did not use any sedative drugs or anything like that." The denial was meant to silence speculation, but instead it opened another door. If not sedation, then what? And why the emphasis? This instinct to shape the narrative became a defining feature of their public image. To some, it was admirable, a display of strength and clarity. To others, it was suspicious, a carefully managed performance. But either way, it was survival. The McCanns knew that in the absence of hard evidence, no body, no eyewitness, no definitive timeline, the story would not be written by facts alone. It would be shaped by emotion, perception, and the imagination of the public. And so they spoke louder than the doubts, clinging to one message above all others: Madeleine was alive. Their words were not just defenses, they were shields. They were the first blows in a battle the McCanns never wanted, a battle not only for their daughter's life, but for their own right to grieve without being condemned. From the earliest days, the McCanns presented themselves with a clarity and discipline that few families in such circumstances could manage. They were grieving, yes, but they were also precise, consistent, and above all, unyielding. They wanted the world to understand one message above all else: Madeleine was not dead, and they had no role in her disappearance. That consistency soon became their public image. It was not the image of shattered parents breaking down in front of cameras, but of two professionals, Kate, a doctor, and Jerry, a cardiologist, who approached their nightmare with reason and resolve. They gave interviews, they held press conferences, they stood tall in front of the lenses that captured every blink, every twitch, every choice of words. And then came the rumor, spreading fast in tabloids and whispers: Madeleine may have been sedated. For many, it was the kind of speculation that attaches itself to uncertainty like a parasite. Was it possible that the child had been given sleeping medication, perhaps too much, leading to tragedy? The suggestion stung like acid. Jerry confronted it immediately, flatly declaring, "We did not use any sedative drugs or anything like that." The denial was supposed to be the end of it, a way to shut down dangerous gossip before it consumed the search for their daughter. But instead of closing the door, it cracked it wider. Why emphasize this so strongly? Why insist so firmly on a point the public had not yet accepted as fact? To some, the defensiveness was suspicious. To others, it was simply the voice of a desperate father, trying to keep the world from spinning out of control. This instinct, to step forward, to shape the narrative before it shaped them, became central to how the McCanns were seen. They understood, perhaps better than most, that without evidence the story would not be told in a courtroom, but in living rooms around the globe. It would be debated in newsrooms, on front pages, in whispers among neighbors, and eventually in the fevered halls of the internet. The McCanns, then, did something most families could never imagine. They took control. They gave the world a version of their story, carefully repeated, unwavering. It was a message of innocence, of cooperation, of relentless hope. And it worked, at least at first. Their words, their calmness, their refusal to collapse became a lifeline for those who wanted to believe that Madeleine might still be found. But visibility is a double-edged sword. The more the McCanns spoke, the more the world listened and judged. Their interviews were replayed, dissected, slowed down frame by frame. Why did Kate not cry on camera? Why did Jerry's voice sound defensive instead of broken? Why had they left their children alone that night while they dined with friends? Suddenly, every word, every gesture, every choice became evidence. Not in a courtroom, but in the unforgiving court of public opinion. And then came Kate's plea. Unlike the measured denials, it was raw, unguarded, trembling with desperation. Please, please don't hurt her. Please don't scare her. Please tell us where to find her. Put her in a place of safety and let somebody know where she is. Those words, spoken through tears, traveled faster than any forensic clue ever could. They appeared on television broadcasts, in newspapers, on posters taped to cafe walls in cities far from Portugal. The words echoed in candlelight vigils, in church services, in rallies of strangers holding photos of a little girl with wide brown eyes. That plea humanized the case in a way no press conference could. For a moment, the world saw not suspicion, not strategy, but a mother begging for her child. It was a moment that touched millions, yet it also highlighted the paradox at the heart of the McCann story. The more they spoke, the more they reached the world, but the more they opened themselves to suspicion. To some, their composure was strength. To others, it was proof of guilt. And as the hours turned into days, and the days into weeks, the public's focus shifted. What began as a desperate search for a missing child became something darker, a debate about truth, credibility, and the fine line between hope and denial. The McCanns had built a public image that carried them forward, but in building it, they also painted a target on their backs. Behind the polished press conferences and carefully chosen words lay the darker, messier heart of the case, the evidence. Or rather, the fragments of evidence. Because, as investigators soon discovered, the timeline of events given by the McCanns and their friends was not perfectly consistent. Subtle changes crept in. One of Jerry's own statements revised a detail he had given earlier, and while the difference seemed small, to seasoned investigators, it was enough to raise a flag. In missing person cases, shifting timelines are rarely meaningless. They can signal confusion or an attempt to shape the story. And then came the dogs. 2 British sniffer dogs, flown into Portugal along with their handler Martin Grime, would become the most controversial players in the investigation. Eddie, the cadaver dog, trained to detect the scent of human decomposition, and Keela, the blood dog, trained to find traces of human blood invisible to the eye. These weren't ordinary animals. Their track record stretched across major investigations worldwide. Their arrival in Praia da Luz marked a turning point. When brought into apartment 5A, Eddie alerted multiple times. He barked near the wardrobe in the parents' bedroom, behind the sofa in the living area, and at Cuddle Cat, the pink toy that had so often been seen in photos with Madeleine. To trained investigators, these alerts were chilling. They suggested the scent of death in the very spaces where Madeleine had lived. Keela followed, pressing her nose against tiles, lingering near the same areas. Her body language was subtle but unmistakable. She too had detected something. To have both dogs, trained for different purposes, alert in overlapping spots was rare and significant. And for the Portuguese police, it was potentially explosive. But it did not stop there. Weeks after Madeleine's disappearance, the McCanns rented a silver Renault Scenic. At first, it seemed unremarkable. Families rent cars while on holiday. It was not unusual. But when the dogs were sent to examine it, both reacted once again. Eddie alerted to the trunk. Keela signaled to blood traces near the boot lining and the car key. The problem was this: the car had only been rented 23 days after Madeleine vanished. Why would there be cadaver scent or blood in a car rented weeks later? The implications were obvious and dangerous. Suspicion, once sympathetic, began to shift. But science complicated the picture. Forensic testing on the samples collected from the apartment and the car revealed no conclusive DNA matches. Some early results suggested partial profiles that could have been consistent with Madeleine's, but they were too degraded, too mixed with other genetic material. Nothing definitive could be drawn. The dog alerts remained powerful to some and circumstantial to others. In a courtroom, they could support evidence but not stand alone. Yet the footage was damning in its own way. Eddie barking sharply again and again at the same spots inside apartment 5A. Kayla pressing her nose against the tiles, still, focused, signaling beneath the surface. To anyone watching, the images were difficult to dismiss. For critics, they became proof. For defenders, they were nothing more than suggestion. But the question hung heavy. What do you do when indirect evidence is all you have? At this stage, the McCann case had already entered dangerous territory. With no body, no conclusive forensic link, no definitive witness, everything depended on fragments, alerts, suspicions, contradictions, and statements. And as those fragments piled up, the case grew less clear, not more. If the dog alerts painted a troubling picture, the phone records added only more shadows. Investigators obtained telecommunications data from the night of May 3rd, 2007, call logs and text messages from the McCanns and their friends in the Tapas group. At first glance, the information looked routine, but as the hours were retraced, inconsistencies appeared. Certain calls were made, while others were conspicuously absent. Some phones rang unanswered with no follow-up. At a time when every second should have mattered, the silence of those unanswered calls felt deafening. Portuguese authorities noted the anomalies but never fully pursued them. Later, an internal report from the UK Home Office revealed that a vast amount of cell site data had been collected, enough to potentially map movements, place individuals near specific locations, confirm or disprove statements. And yet, much of this information was never properly analyzed. In an era of smartphones and GPS, it was a gaping omission. What might have been revealed if timelines had been cross-referenced with phone pings, witness statements, and the dog's alerts? What could investigators have uncovered if they had followed the digital trail with rigor? Instead, that data gathered dust. And the failures did not end there. From the very beginning, the investigation was fractured between two forces: the Portuguese police and their British counterparts. Each operated under different systems, different protocols, different expectations of what counted as admissible evidence. Communication between the two was often strained, sometimes outright hostile. British officers were accused of arrogance. Portuguese officials were accused of incompetence. In the chaos, critical opportunities slipped through the cracks. Evidence was mishandled. Leads went cold. Files remained incomplete. The cadaver dog's alerts were never paired with definitive forensic results. Phone anomalies were logged, but left unexplored. Witness contradictions were noted, but not reconciled. The case became less an investigation than a collection of half-explored paths. For those who study the McCann case, these failures are not only frustrating, they are instructive. They show what happens when two systems fail to work as one, when information is fragmented rather than pooled, when indirect clues are dismissed as speculation instead of woven together into a possible picture. The tragedy is not just what was found, it is what was missed. Madeleine's disappearance was never only about one night in one apartment. It was about how human error, bureaucracy, and mistrust between nations created blind spots large enough for truth to vanish within them. In the search for truth, investigators eventually turned their attention to those closest to Kate and Jerry McCann, their friends, the group later dubbed the Tapas Seven. These were doctors, professionals, parents themselves, who had traveled with the McCanns to Portugal for a holiday. They dined together each evening at a restaurant about 100 meters from the apartments, rotating child checks throughout the night. And their statements became the backbone of the official timeline. At first glance, those statements seemed reassuringly consistent. In broad strokes, they agreed. The group had followed a pattern of checking on the children every 30 minutes. The children were safe, until suddenly, Madeleine was not. But when investigators looked closer, the details began to fray. David Payne was reportedly the last adult, other than Kate or Jerry, to see Madeleine alive. Sometime between 6:30 and 7 p.m., he stopped by apartment 5A while Kate was getting ready. He later said he saw Madeleine in white pajamas with a pink floral design, alive and well, but the exact length of his visit was unclear. He admitted he hadn't entered the bedroom fully, only glanced in briefly, exchanging a few words with Kate at the doorway. Was that glimpse enough to serve as the final confirmation of Madeleine's well-being? Then came Jane Tanner's statement, one of the most debated pieces of testimony in the entire case. At 9:15 p.m., as she walked back from checking her own children, she claimed she saw a man carrying a small child in pajamas across the road near apartment 5A. The description she gave was striking. Light-colored sleepwear, dangling legs, a limp posture. But what made her account controversial was that at that very same moment, Jerry McCann was standing nearby, talking with another man, Jeremy Wilkins. Neither Jerry nor Wilkins saw Tanner. Neither recalled seeing a man carrying a child. How could Tanner have witnessed something so significant while the two men just steps away noticed nothing at all? Matthew Oldfield's account added yet another layer of uncertainty. At 9:30 p.m., he volunteered to check on the McCann children while passing their apartment. He entered through the unlocked patio doors, noticed the children's bedroom door was open wider than before, but heard nothing unusual. Crucially, he did not step far enough inside to see each bed. From his angle, he saw the twins asleep, but not Madeleine's bed directly. Believing all was well, he returned to the restaurant. If he had looked more closely, he might have discovered her disappearance 30 minutes earlier. Instead, the window of time stretched wider. Taken together, the Tapas Seven's testimonies raised unsettling questions. Were the inconsistencies simply the natural fog of memory under stress? Or were they the subtle alignment of stories under group pressure? Psychologists call it conformity bias, the unconscious tendency for individuals to adjust their recollections to fit the group's version of events. Not deliberate lies, but memory reshaped by fear, loyalty, and trauma. To investigators, this dynamic was troubling. The group never contradicted the McCanns publicly. They stood firmly together. But that solidarity, while understandable, meant their accounts rarely clicked into a seamless timeline. Slightly different times, slightly different routes, slightly different descriptions. In a case built on minutes and movements, those small cracks mattered. The Tapas Seven were never accused of wrongdoing, yet their presence, their loyalty, and their imperfect statements became a permanent fixture in the case, illustrating how, in the absence of hard evidence, memory itself can become both the most valuable and the most unreliable witness. At 10 p.m. on the night of May 3rd, it was Kate McCann's turn to check on the children. The routine was set. Every 30 minutes, one of the adults would walk the short distance from the Tapas restaurant back to the apartments. The walk took barely 2 minutes. Nothing in the warm evening air suggested that this check would be any different from the ones before, but the moment Kate opened the apartment door, something felt wrong. The children's bedroom door was open wider than she remembered. That detail alone pricked at her instincts. She stepped further in, and her eyes caught the window. It was open, the shutters raised, the curtains blowing gently in the breeze, and then her gaze fell to Madeleine's bed, empty. The realization hit her like a wave. The twins, Sean and Amelie, lay asleep in their cots, undisturbed. But Madeleine's place was bare. Panic surged through her body, and her mind raced with a single, devastating conclusion. She ran from the apartment, her voice breaking through the night. "They've taken her! They've taken her!" That scream was both an accusation and a plea. It echoed across the resort, drawing others into the nightmare. Jerry, still at the restaurant, reacted with disbelief at first, but within seconds, disbelief turned to frantic action. The Tapas group rushed back to the apartment, splitting up to search corridors, alleys, stairwells, and shadows. Staff members joined in. Voices called out Madeleine's name. Doors were knocked on. Yet, in the chaos, something critical was lost. The apartment, what should have been a preserved crime scene, was left open. People rushed in and out. Evidence, if it existed, was disturbed, perhaps erased. Fingerprints, footprints, scents, all contaminated by panic. No perimeter was secured. No systematic search was coordinated. It was desperation, not protocol, that guided every move in those first hours. Kate's decision to leave the twins sleeping while she ran for help has since been scrutinized endlessly. Why didn't she shout from the balcony? Why not call for assistance without leaving them? The truth lies in the irrational logic of fear. When a child disappears, adrenaline overwhelms reason. Seconds feel like lifetimes. Kate's instinct was singular. Find Madeleine. The twins, safe in their cots, did not register as an immediate danger. It was not neglect, but blind panic, a mother's body overriding rational thought. But in hindsight, that night became a turning point. The McCanns shifted from parents searching for their missing daughter to figures under suspicion. The absence of forced entry raised questions. The open window with no clear sign of tampering fueled doubt. And in the vacuum of definitive answers, suspicion quickly settled on the only people who had been there all along, the parents themselves. As hours bled into the early morning, the chaos hardened into confusion. Police arrived, but the initial assumption of abduction gave way to darker whispers. Could something have happened inside the apartment? Could the McCanns themselves be hiding something? What began as a desperate cry for help became the start of a criminal investigation. The night of May 3rd was no longer only about the disappearance of a child. It became the night a family's life was rewritten, their private grief transformed into public suspicion. And it was the night that set the stage for years of unanswered questions, fractured trust, and a search for truth that still has no end. By dawn on May 4th, Madeleine McCann was no longer just a missing child. She was the face on television screens, the headline in newspapers, the subject of whispers in cafes across Europe. Within hours, her big brown eyes and blonde hair became iconic, etched into the global consciousness. She was transformed into the most recognized missing child in modern history. But with recognition came something else: doubt. The media was relentless. In the beginning, the McCanns were portrayed as tragic parents, victims of a cruel abduction. The British press rallied behind them, framing them as blameless, grieving, desperate for help. Worldwide sympathy poured in. Strangers attended vigils, donations arrived in the millions. Volunteers distributed posters from Lisbon to London. But that narrative didn't last. Soon, headlines shifted. Tabloids began dissecting the McCanns' every move. Why did Kate appear so controlled? Why didn't Jerry break down on camera? Why did they leave their children unattended? In Portugal, the criticism was harsher. Leaving 3 small children alone in an apartment was seen as unthinkable, irresponsible. Cultural judgment deepened suspicion, and suspicion spread. And then came the internet. Social media, still in its early explosive rise, became a breeding ground for theories. Some rational, many dark, most unfounded. Conspiracy forums lit up with speculation. Madeleine had been abducted by a trafficking ring. She had died accidentally in the apartment. The parents had covered it up. She had been taken for organ harvesting. Photographs of children in other countries were circulated, claiming resemblances to Madeleine. Every rumor, no matter how baseless, was amplified, shared, and believed by some. The cadaver dog's alerts fed one narrative. The lack of conclusive DNA fueled another. The inconsistencies in friends' testimonies fueled yet more. Without a body, without a confession, without definitive evidence, the vacuum of truth filled with imagination. For every theory that faded, 2 more rose in its place. The media circus turned the McCanns into dual figures, victims and suspects, tragic parents and potential villains. Every interview was analyzed. Every phrase they spoke was treated as a clue. Were they too calm, too emotional, not emotional enough? Their grief became a spectacle. Their search for Madeleine overshadowed by judgment of their character. And yet, through all of it, Kate and Jerry never let go of their mantra. There is no evidence that Madeleine is dead. They marked every birthday, lit candles for every passing year, and repeated their promise. We will never stop searching. We will leave no stone unturned. That conviction, both admired and questioned, became their shield against a world that seemed determined to pick them apart. But as years stretched into a decade and beyond, the reality grew harsher. More than £10 million were spent on the investigation, making it one of the most expensive missing person cases in history. British, Portuguese, and later German authorities all pursued leads, but each ended in the same place: uncertainty. Suspects were named, including the German drifter Christian Bruckner, but no charges stuck. Files grew heavier, but answers remained absent. The questions linger, unanswered. Why was the window open with no sign of forced entry? Why did Jane Tanner see a man carrying a child, while others nearby saw nothing? Why were critical phone records never fully examined? Why was there no ransom demand if this was an abduction? And perhaps most haunting of all, did someone, somewhere, have a reason to keep this case unsolved? Today, Madeleine would be a young woman in her 20s. Instead, she remains frozen in time, forever 3 years old in photographs, forever missing. Her name is invoked in documentaries, her story retold in news specials, her face remembered in fading posters. But the truth, the only thing that matters, remains elusive. The legacy of the Madeleine McCann case is one of absence. No body, no confession, no closure, just fragments, rumors, suspicions, theories. A silence that grows louder with each year. For the McCanns, it is not an unsolved mystery, it is an open wound. For the world, it is a haunting reminder of how a child can vanish without trace, and how truth itself can disappear with her. And so, the question lingers. Who remembers Madeleine McCann now? For some, her name has faded into the background noise of 1,000 tragedies. For her parents, she is remembered every single day. The fight has never ended, and perhaps never will. Until the truth is found, all that remains is hope and silence.